Hi, I'm Steve Carlson, and I'm the Independence Party and Tea Party candidate for the United States Senate from Minnesota. And I'd like to tell you today that Minnesota needs a fair and balanced party, like the Independence Party. A lot of Democrats might argue, who needs a fair and balanced party when you have Al Franken in the Senate? I know a lot of independent voters who would disagree. America needs voters who don't get their political insights from Saturday Night Live, from Bill Maher, or their competition. Definitely not from Franken. And I believe that on August 12th, if you want protection from the two dominant Minnesota parties, the DFL and the Republicans, you need to get out and vote for me in the U.S. Senate primary, so I can restore and preserve the radical middle, otherwise known as common sense, in Minnesota elections for federal office. Now, an independent voter like me, looking at Minnesota politics today, will see that it's difficult to get any good discussion of what great issues are facing our country. You can get a lot of good discussion on the internet if you're real active, but if you just watch television, here's what you'll find. It's the Republicans. If Obama proposed something outrageous or something just plain incompetent, you'll hear Republicans say that. Democrats say Republicans are obstructing. The party doesn't have any ideas of their own. One small problem. Are you a Republican? If so, were you born a Republican? Or have you just on occasion voted for a name on the ballot with Republican next to it? Or maybe with DFL next to it? The fact is that 41% of Minnesota voters do not identify as Republican or as Democrat, but as independent. So why would we care what Republicans say or Democrats say? We care what Americans say, what people with information say, and we want to hear all sides so we can decide. You see? Fair and balanced. And the truth is, there really are no issues on which all Republicans or Democrats all get together and take a vote and then tell you what they say. So these so-called journalists just make that stuff up out of whole cloth. And as far as the DFL goes, they will not only lie to you, they will use the force of the state to make sure you are not allowed to discuss the issues of the day in your self-governance duties in your precinct caucuses. If you ever want to pull out a copy of the Minnesota Statutes Annotated, that's the book that all your state legislatures write when you elect them. It's got a lot of volumes. I urge you to look up Minnesota Statutes 202A.16, Caucus. Who may participate and vote? Subdivision 1, eligible voters. You're not going to believe this. The kicker is, only those persons who are in agreement with the principles of the party as stated in the party's constitution and who either voted or affiliated with the party at the last state general election or intend to vote or affiliate with the party at the next state general election may vote at the precinct caucus. The precinct caucus, by the way, is the ground level. And if you don't get in on the ground level, you are out. You can read it in the papers what your country decided. And if you, as an independent voter, wander into a precinct caucus and you just want to be a good American, discuss the issues with your neighbors and participate and vote for your representatives in a Republican form of government, that's where you select representatives to go to the legislature rather than everybody just showing up at the Capitol or in Washington. You'll want to look at what your state legislature has done to limit participation in this basic American right. Subdivision 3. Decision by caucus vote. In case the right of a person to participate at the caucus is challenged, the question of the right to participate shall be decided by a vote of the whole caucus, but the person so challenged may not vote on the question of his or her right to participate. Well, maybe you never read the DFL Constitution, but you better, because it is your new Constitution, whether you know it or not. It has replaced our United States Constitution. Now, I would guess that most independent voters don't know if they agree with the principles of the party or not, or didn't before they heard about this. But if you read it, you'll see that it seriously restricts and abridges your ability to participate and vote based on your gender, in violation of the 19th Amendment of the United States Constitution, and your race, in violation of the 15th Amendment. One thing is pretty clear to those of us who have been watching politics for a while, and that is there is this intense effort by public school teachers and media at all levels, local and national, and the DFL, to change the way you think about selected issues. A noticeable example is marriage. And when you look at the party, I would also say there is this little issue that when the DFL brought this issue to the campaign, that those who wanted to protect Minnesota's definition of marriage against the movement sweeping the country to define it as allowing homosexuals or lesbians to be declared married to each other in order to gain the financial advantages we give to married families, the DFL said normal people hated homosexuals and discriminating against them by recognizing marriage as it has always been. And they said they would just have this little conversation. They immediately rushed to totally define marriage in the way they would like it to be defined. Now back to the who may participate and vote section. If you had just got a bunch of the neighbors who follow politics together, say by putting up signs and notices that there would be a local precinct caucus to decide who to send to the next level in one of the major parties, say the DFL or GOP, you would have had a pretty representative sample of those who follow this stuff. And if you had asked them, what is marriage? That is to say, before the DFL re-engineered it for us, they probably would have got it right. Well, you know, the birds and the bees, a thing called love, and they settle down, raise little Johnny and Susie, and maybe send them off to college or marry them off. Well, today we're told that would be wrong. You flunk, go to the back of the class. I can remember back to when a lot of people would have called that brainwashing, using the public schools and political parties and the media to say all the same thing in chorus, to change basic beliefs about how you think and live. Now, you don't find this in the history of our country or even in our Constitution. And the DFL does it by violating the United States Constitution and replacing it with the DFL Constitution. And I explain here. Al Franken, in his New York bestseller Lies and the Lying Liars Who Tell Them, by which he means Fox News, the Wall Street Journal, and the other New York paper and Washington paper, admits at page 1, well, he can't just tell you the so-called journalists have been pushing homosexuality on America for decades. The way Al and the DFL think, they first have to tell you what to think and then reveal a little bit of what they really think. So Al writes, compared to the American public at large, probably a slightly higher percentage of journalists, because of their enhanced power of discernment, realize that they know a gay person or two and are therefore less frightened of them. Unquote. Well, Al Franken wrote this in 2003, more than 10 years ago. Today, when we have Al Franken in the U.S. Senate and his party, the DFL, and if you have, as I have, sat there in the Minnesota Senate and their committees and listened to their leader on things homosexuals state on the record that religious people with scruples about doing these things to mom, apple pie, baseball, and marriage, that they can't come out of their sanctuaries without being told by the civil magistrate what marriage is, and teachers can't teach in the public schools if they aren't prepared to brainwash every student in the name of and with the force of the state that being a homosexual, marrying someone of your same gender, marrying, and adopting other children and teaching them the same thing is not just perfectly normal, everyday United States of America. Well, frightened? Sure. I mean, we have nothing to fear except fear itself, right? But yes, the idea that homosexuals, combined with an unprincipled head like Barack Obama, could turn our nation upside down and into a ditch, threaten our children, our families, our schools, our military, the lives of the brave men defending our nation, and the women who help them, our churches, religious liberties, sure, I'm shocked and concerned. Homosexuals through this political agenda have crossed the line, and we've got to get this nation back on track immediately. The only other bias Al would admit in his media business, as he calls it, is that, as he joked, these imaginary journalists gave the Noah's Ark crowd a fair shake in the evolution debate. So now you won't hear this from the Minnesota GOP, but I think you better take a look at how the DFL accomplishes this. Basically, how do they get such crazies making all the decisions for their party, telling us what to think, and threatening all American institutions? How do they do it? Well, first, instead of the American Constitution, we now have the DFL Constitution. And they have given their party constitution the full force of a legal mandate by the participation and voting statute mentioned above. when I sat in a debate with Betty McCollum and listened to her say she wants to fight for voting rights. And I thought of these harsh restrictions on the voting rights of Minnesotans by her own party. I saw a serious contradiction with this DFL party line. Later, in the law library, I came across this statute they put in the voting laws of the state, which violate the U.S. Constitution, as I mentioned. And I was very troubled and brought it to our politically biased Minnesota Supreme Court. For instance, just before I got there, Mark Dayton rushed in and appointed Al Franken's elections attorney in the recount, David Lillyhaug, to be on the Minnesota Supreme Court. The Supreme Court wouldn't hear of the challenges to the DFL Constitution, naturally. They are not interested in the U.S. Constitution, the First Amendment, and all that. They accept the DFL Constitution as the limitation on your freedom of political expression and association during the precinct caucus, even though your right to attend and vote in that precinct caucus is specifically secured in our own Minnesota Constitution. And so they have left the DFL restrictions on voting and participation by gender and race in place, in clear violation of the U.S. Constitution. By the way, if you are voting for Lori Swanson, she wants to take away your First Amendment right to vote in violation of the 15th and 19th Amendments of the United States Constitution, and to back this political engineering by the state and the DFL leaders. She will fight tooth and nail against the U.S. Constitution and First Amendment and demanding the DFL Constitution and its new Minnesota political order. I'd say this is highly dangerous, and it is a serious mistake to leave this situation as it is. Talk about reach out and touch someone. The DFL reaches out and knockouts any truly free American in Minnesota with their DFL Constitution, which, as I say, has replaced the U.S. Constitution as far as elections go. Lori Sturtevant of the Strip calls it proportional representation. Now this comes from the DFL Central Committee and is modeled after the Communist Party, like in Russia or China, not an American party. Ironically, in Section 1, like Franken's page 1, of its general rules and policy, the DFL redefines outreach and inclusion. But it should read, reach out and exclude someone. Let's get straight to the bottom of the section. It says, quote, groups shall be represented on delegations and in party offices in reasonable proportion to their presence in the state, unquote. So what are these groups in the new political order of the DFL? Quote, young people, the elderly, women, the handicapped, and minority groups, whether by race, ethnic groups, or sexual preference, unquote. I attended a precinct caucus of the DFL once in St. Paul. At the end of the meeting, the woman who was the chair announced that the party required that at least 50% of the delegates be women, and that a majority of the delegates chosen were men. Therefore, she said, men had to volunteer to become alternates so a woman could take their place. You think that is not a quota? It's a quota. Too many men, you have to get off. She started with the man who, for health reasons, sent me as his proxy. But since she said he was a minority, she moved on to the other men to give up their voting status. I mean, can you believe this? And it directly violates the 14th Amendment. Here is Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. It reads in relevant part, quote, but when the right to vote at any election for representatives in Congress is denied to any of the male inhabitants of such state, or in any way abridged, the basis of representation therein shall be reduced in the proportion which the number of such male citizens bear to the whole number of male citizens 21 years of age in such state. Well, I just explained that at the DFL Precinct Caucus, as the Minnesota law requires it to be conducted, the right of, quote, any of the male inhabitants, unquote, of the state is both denied and abridged, because they can't be voting delegates and they can't even participate if they challenge this. I don't know why the Republicans don't care about this, but they are totally aware of the litigation in which I raised this. But I think that independent voters do want to know, and we want to stop. I could not participate in the DFL as a candidate because of this. But look at the 19th Amendment. Do you think it gave women the right to vote? No, it did not. It did not give anybody the right to vote. What it does is bar exclusion of any voter because of gender. It reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Unquote. And yet, as I just recounted, in Minnesota, who Al Franken currently represents in the U.S. Senate, where he is trying to eliminate protections of the First Amendment, the state requires, with the force of law, that the right of citizens be both denied and abridged by the state of Minnesota on account of sex. And finally, the 15th Amendment. Did it give freed slaves the right to vote? No. Again, it reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Unquote. Again, if my friend at the DFL precinct caucus, whose proxy I was that night, had not been a minority, but me, my right to be a voting delegate would have been denied or abridged, unless I simply refused to get off the slate, and all the other white males also refused. In that case, our new Minnesota political order, our slate could have been challenged and rejected based on race and gender at the next DFL convention level. Now, Michael Davis, the first black federal judge in Minnesota, said the U.S. Constitution does not apply to this matter, but the DFL Constitution is setting quotas for blacks and whites, men and women, straight and homosexual. And you see what that party has become and what it is doing to our state, attacking our state constitution and negating the U.S. Constitution. The first black Supreme Court judges, the heroic Alan Page and Wilhelmina Wright, appointed by Mark Dayton, and David Lillyhout, Al Franken's elections attorney, refused to follow the U.S. Constitution. And they might say, well, but those amendments you keep talking about, that's about a state denying and abridging your right on the basis of gender and the basis of race. But they say the DFL is just a private organization, just a little private club. Well, as an independent voter and candidate, I am sick of this stuff. Are you? Do you even believe how our politicians and judges are conducting themselves? I would not have. I assumed I could trust these guys. And yes, I do believe the Democrat Party is covered by the requirements of the United States Constitution. And I'll be happy to argue with the DFL any place, anytime, including in the general election for the U.S. Senate with Al Franken. And I'm currently waiting on a decision from the 8th Circuit United States Court of Appeals on that very matter. I guess they're thinking it over. I believe it was finally briefed in March 2014. Now, I'm fair and balanced. I just report the news, the facts. And that is your new political order in Minnesota and in many other states, like California and Texas. And that it is personally important to Barack Obama. He visits these states and demands these gender, racial, and homosexual quotas in the state Democratic Constitution. You need a vehicle where the fickle, independent voters of Minnesota can caucus if they need to, or vote in Minnesota's open primaries, support alternative candidates, and to break down the DFL barricades to democracy in Minnesota. Now, I could go on and explain to you how Al Franken has actually introduced resolutions in the U.S. Senate to repeal and void the First Amendment and give legislative bodies control over not only what's to be contributed for elections, but in-kind donations to elections. That's right, S.J. Res. 19, Senate Joint Resolution 19, and Amy Klobuchar introduced it as well. That is the future of your new Minnesota political order. No First Amendment, just Al Franken. No United States Constitution, just the DFL Constitution. Do you want this? I don't. As an American, I find it repulsive. I find it tyranny. I'm asking you to vote on Independence Day in Minnesota, August 12th, to keep independence alive. Vote for me, Steve Carlson, for the United States Senate at the top of your ballot, and I promise you I'll get to the bottom of this assault on the United States and its democratic form of government. You want to fight for voting rights? Vote for me. Empower me, and I will take this up in the debates and in the general election against Al Franken and the news media across this country. Don't repeal the First Amendment. Repeal Al Franken. I'm Steve Carlson, and I approve this message.